Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You are listening to another installment of the NTC podcast. We're glad to be back with you guys in another episode, back on the mic. Myself and Colin, good to be back with you guys as per usual. This evening, we have the special opportunity to get some thoughts from the one and only Seth Partnow, aka Anchorage Man on Twitter, if you guys follow him. He is the director of sports over at StatsBomb. He produces some words for The Athletic. He has a book, if you guys haven't noticed, The Mid-Range Theory, which is very interesting. I highly suggest taking a look at his book that came out not too long ago. He was a previous director of basketball research over at the Bucks. So obviously, Seth has a wealth of knowledge and experience that he brings to this podcast. We're really excited to have him. Seth, I'm glad that we didn't scare you away after our last pod. I think it was Summer League 21. I'm trying to represent here with my T-shirt here this evening, but glad we didn't scare you off, man. Glad you decided to come back with us and for another round.
I feel like I've been on since then, but it all sort of the last 3 years sort of all collapsed together.
Together for sure.
Yeah. No, it really does. It's like, was that 21, 20, 22? Who knows these days? It all kind of just becomes one big blur in your memory,
Right.
But yeah, we hope everything is well with you, Seth. It's been a crazy season, as we'll get into here in a little bit. We wanted to dive into some numbers here specifically. I mean, that's your fortes, analytics numbers. This is going to be a deep dive on some analytical trends throughout the season, some other storylines that we've noticed that have really been kind of coming up. As you are aware, the Sloan Analytics Conference took place not too long ago, beginning of March. As of this recording, March 22nd. It wasn't that long ago, so we wanted to kind of dive into a few things that were discussed during that conference as well. But really to kind of start this whole thing off, Seth, we wanted to get into one of those topics that were discussed during the conference. It's 2023. Technology's on the rise. The way the game basketball is played, the way the game is broken down, research is a lot different than it was 5-10 years ago. And one trend that is starting to kind of creep its way into front offices, the game in general, is the rise of AI. We can break it down really simply, just as far as like how it's starting to incorporate itself into the basketball world. I'll give an example. I'm in a work league for fantasy basketball, Yahoo Sports. And you go into the app and you used to have to do everything yourself, manually inputting players on a day-to-day basis, manually picking up players, trying to figure out who to drop, who to pick up. Now some of the stuff is automated. Like I just picked up, for instance, Austin Reeves off the waiver wire. It's my championship week. And I went in there to set my lineup, and there's a button in there that says, set your lineup for every day from today to Sunday, the end of the matchup. You hit a button, and it does it all by itself. It gives you suggestions on who you should pick up, who you should drop. So I just use that as an example as to how at the lowest level, we can see AI and automated things starting to creep in. But we want to focus on NBA, the big leagues, all that stuff in general. So we wanted to open the floor to you, Seth. Like when it comes to AI, like what is your first thought when it comes to AI working its way into franchises? Do you see this as a huge plus, a negative, indifference?
I see it as frankly, there's a lot of snake oil being sold right now. Mm-hmm. Like automation is good. Automation doesn't sound sexy. AI sounds sexy. So there's a lot of people out here saying we're going to do AI, and it's the stuff you're talking about with I don't want to suggest it's trivial in terms of a recommendation engine and auto setting lineups and stuff like that. But that stuff is all like reasonably straightforward in terms of you get some rule based systems, and if X then Y. There's a little bit of muscle, but that's not especially complicated. Right. In terms of something, when we're talking about AI, there's a mysticism about there being some kind of actual like human-like intelligent thinking and pulling trends out that nobody has ever seen before and making recommendations that weren't possible. And we're not there. We're not close to there. Like that kind of stuff is there's certain things that AI what is called AI now, I prefer actually machine learning because I think it's a little there's a certain anchoring to sort of like iRobot or something like that when you say AI, which doesn't really that almost gets this sort of quote unquote intelligence that's being developed exactly opposite. So, but it's the kind of thing that if you know a little bit about something and you're talking to people who know nothing about something, you can come up with enough buzzwords around AI to maybe draw someone in. There are certainly some interesting, we've seen, chat GPT and those things. There's certainly some interesting applications, and certainly a lot of, going back to even, when StatsMuse first came out about, getting some natural language processing to actually solve queries. But those are all very sort of rote tasks, if you will. And it's just a matter of if you define the question correctly, then the machine can quickly search for and spit out what, as far as it can tell, the best answer from its whatever its training set, its resources are. That's a very different thing than who should we trade for? How much should we trade for this person? What is the market value of so on and so forth? And those more dynamic things, those things that are based on dynamics that may or may not have historical precedent. We're nowhere near the point where I would trust like anything automated to even understand the course that we're on. I mean, it's I'm sure you guys have seen everything about self-driving cars. You put them on a closed course where nothing comes, they can mosey their way around, and it's great.
Yeah.
You put them in a real world system, it's like, oh, a deer. Shit. I don't know what that is. Like driving. There's in my neighborhood here in Milwaukee, there's, believe it or not, a pack. I don't know if it's a pack. I don't know what a group of wild turkeys is called. A gaggle, whatever. A bunch.
We'll go with that.
A family, something of wild turkeys that kind of walks around the neighborhood sometimes. And there's like in one of the main roads right by my house, it's like there's a median, and you drive down the road and there's this big old turkey in the median. Like, how does a computer that has never seen a turkey on the road before know what that is and respond to it? I can see that. And it's a turkey. It's big. I don't want to hit the turkey. I slow down. But that's, the analogy that I'm making to, that's kind of like a deer or a dog or a duck that human intelligence can do that, but computer intelligence can't necessarily for novel things like that. And when we're dealing in sort of a more creative realm, like who should we sign, how much for, what kind of trades are there, how do we negotiate this trade? I don't know that the sort of the pure computational solution is there. Now, if you want to, you have some kind of player value metric, and you can say, all right, find me all the combinations of cap legal trades that we could make with team X, and then parameter by these players included or not included, and it adds one or more wins to our theoretical win total on this player value model, and spit that out. Like that's a very valuable kind of sorting thing, but that's not that isn't at all the same thing as I think what people who are the most optimistic about AI are suggesting is happening or is on the verge of happening.
That's kind of what I was thinking immediately too, was from what it could immediately be is, as far as, similar to the chat GPT, side of things, is, okay, I need the available people. If I put this person on the block for this position, give me all of the available trades that I can make where it can spit it out. And I don't know if we're already there within some front offices where they can pull that up, pretty quickly already. But I wonder if it's going to creep in and become more dynamic than it is right now.
Yeah, and also, like, to some degree, you also wonder if there is value in actually the manual. I think there might be some value in the manual process of actually doing it, because it forces you to think about the players.
Right.
And I think just getting like a list of all the possibilities doesn't really force you to, would I trade player A for player B straight up?
Yeah.
No. How much more would I need? How much more would I be willing to get if they're not willing to do it? Like, you kind of skip that step if you just get the list of here are all the possibilities.
Yeah.
See if they'll do any of them.
I think one of the other major parts, and you talked with Eric Pincus about this around the trade deadline, about gaining intel on what the other teams need and adding that layer of possibility of what they're looking for, and then, roping in a third team. I think that, and going through the process with in that way manually, is probably a huge help too.
And that's another, it's also another thing that's an additional complexity to it is it's a multi-period game. Like you don't just do one thing, you do while you're acting, everyone else is acting at the same time. So there's not, like modeling that out of how that actually works in, a 30-way standoff. Good luck, I guess, if you think that a computer is going to do that right now better than sort of the shoe leather of a well-run front office that is going to make contact with 29 other teams and get like the lay of the land that way, trying to sort of impute how 29 other GMs are going to act when they, some of them might have only been on the job a month. Some of them might have new ownership. Some of them might be facing new demands from ownership. Some of them might have convinced ownership to take a new direction. And so how much of their previous behavior, Sam Presti's always going to trade all of his guys for draft picks. Well, Oklahoma City's probably at the point where they're not doing that anymore.
Right.
So how much does Sam Presti's past behavior as a GM really tell you about what Oklahoma City is going to want to do and value, over this offseason heading into next trade deadline?
And never mind the next layer of whether the player on that team wants to sign an extension with that team. And there's no way of even knowing that. The player might not even know that yet. So,
or they might change their mind, which
exactly.
Right. Yeah. There's just so many layers to this. It seems like we keep coming back to those factors that are not strictly like objective factors.
There aren't
like certain things we can't plan for that an AI can't pick up on. Intangibles, like when it comes time for the draft, we always talk about intangibles. Like that's something that a computer program can't pick up on. Work ethic, leadership, things like that. It takes into account the numbers that are on hand as of the draft. So it's like, okay, what is this true shooting percentage in college? What is this rebounding percentage? What is this usage rate? All that stuff. But that is not, how we kind of evaluate players completely. There's a number side of it, but there's also, how does he interact with his teammates? Is he coachable? Things like that. It just can't be captured with numbers. So that's definitely.
And you can try to, and we probably can chip away at that. But then you're building in, you're building in bias without even knowing it there, because it's like, well, this is what I think good interaction is.
Right.
Maybe it is, maybe it isn't.
And you're doing it at that point. I mean, is it, at what point is it AI? At what point is it you? So
yeah. I think it's like anything else. When we came to the analytical revolution, when the Rockets were making waves and Daryl Morey was making waves, there's definitely a place for it. In sports, it's definitely a tool to be used, but in no way, shape, or form is it something that you should rely on solely. That's where you kind of lose sight of different things. So if it's a collaborative effort to where here are some certain gaps that AI can fill in, here are certain gaps that the numbers can fill in, the analytics can fill in that maybe I can't completely gather, or I can't do it in a timely manner. That's the other thing about it. Like, what if this AI thing can just kind of start to trim down on the time it takes to gather information? Gather intel, things like that, to where it would take us X time to do it. Maybe it's subtracted a little bit. I mean, that's definitely a value, especially in a space like this where every second counts. You need every competitive advantage you can get.
But you have to be very clear about the kinds of info that it can get and the kinds it can't.
Yeah.
And again, that sort of gets us back. There are time-saving elements of it, but there are still not shortcuts to okay, fine. You can your AI can hack into the computer system of every university and get players' grades. Okay, that might tell you something, but they can't, the AI can't go to campus and ask the academic tutor about the player.
Right.
And and to whatever extent that conversation has sort of signaled towards how the player will progress as an NBA player, which is, that's a whole other question, but AI ain't going to help you answer that question either.
Right. Yeah, there's so many layers to this that we can examine, and obviously, I think the kind of consensus we're coming to is that it's a pretty cool idea in theory, but there are shortfalls, and that's what I was thinking about. Like, there are benefits and there are challenges. I made two separate categories, and basically, what we were talking about is like, hey, competitive advantage, that's great. You have AI. Maybe it's something that another franchise doesn't have. It can give you a leg up in certain facets of the game. But on the other side, like you guys were just talking about, there are certain things you can't measure. And, Seth, I like your analogy to, car technology. I'm a big car guy, so I try to be in the weeds when it comes to that type of stuff, like what's coming up the pipeline, what's in trend right now, what's being introduced in the world of technology on that front. And, obviously, all this stuff is nice in theory, but there's a human component of it that, at least at this time, cannot be replaced. So we just need to kind of keep that in mind through all of it.
Yeah, and I don't want to sound like I'm like a Luddite saying it's never gonna. It's just we just have to be very. Yeah. I think that we get ahead of ourselves talking about what this stuff can do, when it's going to be able to do these things, when it's actually, a basketball front office is not going to be the place where AI first makes a big splash.
Right.
Like, these are basketball teams, not technology companies. So there's a certain degree of someone else is going to have to prove it works first. Or, some teams might spend some time spinning their wheels, but I'll take the team that has a good, solid process that integrates, kind of more traditional analytics and scouting and asks the right questions and does the stuff the old fashioned way. I think that's going to continue to be an advantage. And frankly, even when like these more advanced tools come in, it's not just simply having these tools, it's knowing how to use them.
Exactly.
The same way the analytics is.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. No, 100%. So, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of numbers to kind of determine a lot of things in the NBA. When it comes to scouting, we just talked about, when it comes to what trades to make, who to extend and what for and everything like that. There's some other numbers around the NBA that we wanted to examine. And, Seth, before we came on, we went back and, obviously you had an article back in November. I think it was November 9th or so that you posted on The Athletic. Yeah, we don't want to or goes out to call you out. I mean, the NBA is hard to predict. I mean, who could have foreseen that this offensive explosion would continue? But, we wanted to get into basically, what's been going on in the NBA as far as the scoring surge. So we've seen 40, 50, 60-point games all over the place. Colin, I think you mentioned earlier that, we're at one of our all-time high league average points per game numbers that's maintained. It's held since the beginning of the season to now. Pretty incredible numbers here. So, Seth, essentially what me and Colin wanted to do here is like get your thoughts on this explosion here. You thought that at the beginning of the season it might not hold for a variety of reasons, and they're very solid reasons. Obviously, it has held, and it's just been kind of continuing to build as the season's gone along. So when it comes to the reasons as to why this has been a thing, what's been driving not just the introduction of league high scoring, but the maintaining over the course of the season, there's a lot of different factors in this, rule changes, the talent level of players, just different play styles and things like that. But what comes to your mind first when you're thinking about the reasons as to why these numbers have been so substantial, why they've held over the course of 70 games at this point in the season?
Sure. So the first thing is part of it is the league is playing, a little faster than it has. Like the last couple of years, the pace has been gradually increasing. So just in terms of point totals, like we're getting, 3-4 extra possessions a game than we were, a couple of years ago. So that's part of it. But the per possession efficiency, I think there's a combination of things, and I think we've probably hit a tipping point of a confluence of factors that have suddenly made it impossible to guard in the NBA. So you mentioned the skill level of player, the deployment of players. Every team basically understands, just to a large degree, spacing the floor, using the 3-point line to make the defense cover the maximum area possible. Something that's really started to happen more over the last couple of years is we see teams that don't just have one ball handle on the floor. They have 3, they have 4, they have 5 guys who maybe they're not like point guard skill level players, but 5 guys who can catch the ball, make a play with the ball, who can punish a mismatch, who can drive a closeout, who can shoot a 3 if necessary, who can cut an offense. Like, so there aren't the analogy I've started using recently is for a long time, NBA teams, if you had to choose, who do you want on the floor? Do you want Torrey Craig or George Niang on the floor? I think those are reasonably comparable players, one of whom is a very good, like one of whom skews towards the defensive, one of whom skews towards the offensive, or skews towards offensively talented. I'm not saying I want to say George Niang is offensive. And it used to be, I think, 20 years ago, every team except the Suns, basically, is picking the defensive guy. A couple of years ago it was maybe 50-50. Now it's, aside from Phoenix, and that's just because that's who they got on their roster. I think every team is taking the offense, is choosing to play the offensive guy. Now that does the 2 things. One, that makes offenses harder to guard because there's 5 guys you got to guard. One of the big worries you have about, like, say, Philadelphia going to the playoffs is PJ Tucker's an offensive passenger, and I don't know if that works anymore. But there are more lineups where you have like 5 guys who can do things, so that makes it harder to guard. Plus, the choice that you're choosing George Niang and not Torrey Craig means that's 1 less good defender on the floor and a weaker defender is there. So it's those things kind of spiraling together to create a sort of a continuing cycle of buckets. And then on top of that, I think that NBA defenses haven't adjusted at all to this sort of multi-skilled, multi-ball handler environment. It's my podcast partner on Nerder She Wrote, Mo Dakhil, likes to talk about this a lot. Defenses are very predictable. Like NBA defenses, like, okay, if we get the ball to this spot on the floor, the help will come from this direction. This will be the rotation. So dribble there, pass, open shot there, like clockwork.
Yeah.
And, in the playoffs, when teams can start to game plan for pet actions and stuff like that, those rotations become a little less rote. They can do some stuff to slow the ball movement down a little bit, so it's not as sort of just point to point open shot. But over 82 games, like, teams are just kind of trying to get through the 82 games, and so they're running their defensive stuff. And you go, well, against this team, if we set an angle pick and roll and the guy helps off the corner, and then we drive and kick and swing, open 3 every time. Or if the guy doesn't help, then it's just so easy to create these advantages where the defense is in rotation.
And that was going to be my question. Do you think that there's going to be some kind of defensive revolution where the strategy just in general is going to change, where it can just take place through the 82 games, and it's going to be their defense, and it's going to just adjust. They're going to be able to adjust.
I like what I've seen from OKC this year. There's just sort of the two avenues. One is sort of the switch everything.
Yeah.
And in some ways that actually spurred, I think, the got to have multiple ball handlers, because it was, we'll just switch and then you can't get the advantage, and then they got to throw the ball to the guy who can't do anything, who's the screener. Well, what if we put another ball handler on the floor then instead? Now we've switched, and suddenly your 6'1" point guard is guarding 6'8" George Niang.
Right.
Okay, if that when that was, I don't know, Montrezl Harrell or Paul Reed or something like that, it's like, okay, fine. Try to back him down and see if that's good offense. But now that it's a guy who can, dribble, pass, and shoot, it's a tougher thing. But so like Boston, Golden State have the personnel to like make that work. I think from a more traditional, and even they have a lot of switchability, but they use it in different ways. It's like Oklahoma City, I think, is the team that I've noticed that has done a consistently good job of sort of staying home early in the shot clock, not giving up those sort of rotations, and then later in the shot clock being very aggressive with switching and trapping and stuff like that. So almost making, as free flowing as offenses have become, with multiple players able to be creative and do stuff, they're almost bringing a little bit of that to the defensive side of the ball. And it helps if you have, a bunch of of 6'8" long arm guys. Like even like Josh Giddey might not be the fastest guy in the world, but he's enormous, and that helps.
Yeah. I mean, he's 6'7", and I like how you use OKC.
I was 6'7". I would take the over on that. He is big.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say definitely. Like, I mean, he's a big guard. Like you look at him on the court. I think they mentioned it during the broadcast last night. I was watching OKC versus the Clippers, and he had a shot over Paul George. Like I think it was like a short floater from the left block, and it banked in. And people are like, I mean, Giddey is not a small guy. Like, I mean, you look at him, and it's like, okay, he's not the most athletically gifted, like you said, but I mean, he can get a shot over some pretty tall players. That floater he's starting to develop. So I like how you used OKC as an example, because I noticed last night as well that they were playing Jalen Williams. So not J-Dub, J-Will. So the bigger guy, the second rounder from Arkansas, they played him at center. And I think they're leaning into that in order to kind of spur on that defensive strategy you're talking about when it comes to switch everything. Because everybody, including Shea, they're between 6'5" and 6'8", I believe. And you got Dort out there, the torture chamber. So it's like you kind of cover a lot of holes if you're playing that way.
And then the other thing they did is I've just talked about switching or whatever, but then also like their teams are so like another thing that can happen is teams are so willing to give up like the soft switch and let you're playing the Mavericks, Luka's going to run a billion pick and rolls. If you're going to soft switch, which guy do I want guarding me is basically what you're letting him ask. I mean, then you look at OKC in the last possession last night, and how many times did they try to set screens for Kawhi to get Dort off of Kawhi? And they're just like
4 or 5 screens.
No, we're not switching. No. And that's teams just being a little, you don't want this guy guarding your best player? Well, we do want him guarding your best player then. And so we're going to stick to that. And I think, teams being a little just more attentive to that, whether that's something you can do over 82 games, whether that's a good argument for shortening the season in and of itself, but we don't need to get into that here, I don't think. But yeah.
And people will say I kind of want to transition to this a little bit too, the defense that's being played today. And a lot of people will say, I think Pau Gasol was probably the most prominent person that said this recently, like, I hate how there's no defense played today in today's NBA. I feel like that's not fair to these NBA teams that come out here. They have strategies that sometimes work. But like you said, Seth, that's hard to do over 82 games. When you're playing the Kings one night, you're playing the Celtics another night, you're playing the Nuggets that just have these incredible offensive talents. And again, like all these teams have 4 or 5 guys that can make a play for them or others. It's really hard. I mean, you can try your absolute best, but it's always said, great offense will beat great defense every time. So it's not like these guys don't care or they're not capable. It's just that, over the course of the season, you're driving and passing and kicking. Eventually something's going to break. And it's hard to prevent that for however many possessions in a game, 100 whatever possessions per game for 82 games. It's a big ask to these players.
Plus, if you just in terms of advantage creation, if you can reliably get a little reverse pivot when you're setting a ball screen, if you can reliably maybe put your hand under the ball and make 2 or 3 moves on one dribble, if you can get that extra, if you can have learned to exploit the gather step rule so you can change directions 2 or 3 times after you pick the ball up, those all contribute to being just very hard to prevent offenses from creating advantages. And again, advantage creation plus many multi-skilled players on the floor mean you're getting a lot of good shots for people who can make shots. And the league, the skill level on the floor is just, it's higher than it's ever been.
So with that, I wanted to ask, and I don't know if you had this as a specific subject, Aaron, but your article also talked about the heliocentrism, and you were leading it with Luka at the time, and they were 6-3, and you kind of predicted that, over time it's probably going to fade off, and who knows how it's going to work in the playoffs. Of course, they got Kyrie, and still not going great. But it's interesting that, we talk about them having all these talented scorers, but then we're still seeing, 23, 50 plus point games and, 270 point games and 260 point games. Why do you think we're still seeing that even with so many talented offensive players built around those guys? Well, maybe not Luka, but
yeah, so it's interesting that even though we are seeing more skill on the floor, we are still seeing a continuing greater concentration of offense generation in teams. I think it's probably I haven't looked at it since the beginning of the year, but I think it's probably the rate of increase of sort of the top heaviness of offenses has probably slowed a little bit, but where that is still whether or not the extremes of the heliocentrism are the best way to do it. I think at this point, I think we can say, I don't want to say conclusively, but evidence is strongly suggesting that, wringing that last little bit out of the one guy is probably not where it's at in terms of really having, extended reliable success, especially into the postseason. But the Mavs roster is what it is. And so, I've just been talking about like the amount of multi-skilled guys that teams have. They're kind of an exception because they and to some degree the Hawks are still like, well, we got the one guy who can hold the ball. We don't want to have anyone else hold the ball. And so we'll get guys who don't need the ball and don't need the ball turns into can't really have the ball. And, it's like, do you want Reggie Bullock operating, second side pick and rolls? Probably not.
Yeah.
Probably not. Yeah.
Yeah. Like guys like, it's funny. Dorian Finney-Smith was actually, like it was not something you want to do every time, but something he could do a little. And so you just, even like those sort of tertiary players, like they've kind of lost. So now it's really just the two guys and maybe, Christian Wood can get a shot for himself or Jaden Hardy when he's in the game can, use athleticism to get a contested jumper off, but there really is not a lot of variety of players who can do things for the Mavs. And I think that is a huge weakness for them headed towards the postseason.
100%.
Do you think that like with a lot of these teams doing that and having the similar strategy is why the West is so bunched up as far as records, or do you think that's just the way it's just played out this year in general?
I think that's a lot. I mean, it's played out that way with injuries, with the Clippers and Warriors, and to some degree Memphis. I mean, both between injuries and kind of other absences. Like the only of the teams that like entered the year, this team is gonna we're pretty sure this team is gonna be good. Denver's the only one that's been largely healthy all year.
Right.
And then, some other teams that, Phoenix really hasn't had their team on the floor at any point. Even like before the trades, they were, CP was out a lot. Booker was out a lot. Yeah. And, some of the other teams, the Timberwolves didn't really come together. So it's a lot of there's all these teams that had sort of questions entering the year. And a lot of them got hurt and just sort of faded away. Doesn't mean that if they get healthy in the playoffs. Now the Clippers, obviously, Paul George getting hurt last night probably is not great for them. The Warriors, again, just, you don't, whatever the situation with Andrew Wiggins is, that's a pretty huge. So it's like which team? I mean, is Phoenix get healthy and put together a run, or is it just all breaking Denver's way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Memphis, do they get Ja back? I mean, they played well without Ja, so he comes back. Maybe they give a run to Denver.
I worry about I frankly worry about them having enough dudes in a playoff situation.
Yeah,
like enough guys who can okay, it's Ja and Desmond Bane. Jaren Jackson can sometimes, but
yeah.
How much do you really want the ball in Dylan Brooks's hands in a playoff setting?
Yeah,
he can shoot you out of a game for sure. That's definitely worrisome. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely kind of like, hey, who's just going to separate themselves? Because like you guys are saying, everybody's all bunched up. The Mavericks specifically, just going back to them for a second in Luka's situation, I just worry for them that they're kind of running the same course as Harden did with the Rockets. And I agree with you, Seth. I think having him assume such a big workload over the course of the season, I think is starting to wear on him. And there's diminishing returns to that, especially when you get to a playoff scenario. Harden, I mean, I'm referencing an article here by Matt Issa, who we had on our podcast a few weeks ago. He did an article for The Analyst, and he mentioned that Harden had a usage rate of 40% back in 18-19, and Harden was running about 23.8 possessions per game where there was a pick and roll involved. And then I went back and looked at Luka's points per game for the season. I mean, he's at 36 minutes a game, which is actually the highest he's averaged in his career so far. He's always played a lot of minutes, but for some reason this season it's just above and beyond what he's done so far. He's missed 5 games in a row. He's supposed to come back tonight against Golden State, but he's missed 3 Memphis games, including also one against the Spurs and the Lakers. But what's interesting, though, and I don't think this will hold in the playoffs, but his effective field goal percentage is actually higher than in the last few seasons. It's at 56% right now, which, historically it's been somewhere between 51, 53%, I believe. And then Matt mentioned in his article, part of that is because they're running more post-up plays for Luka. So he's able to kind of feast on those mismatches, which we talked about a little bit earlier, that are generated from switches through those pick and rolls, to build up his efficiency a little bit more during the season. So when you think about this, Seth, and his production so far, do you think that adjustment in his game, more pick and rolls, can help him be a little bit more productive in the playoffs, to help him kind of shave off some of that diminished value that comes with playing so many minutes? How do you think that might play out?
I have a hard time buying, just again because they're so. I think ideally, Luka, like getting Luka the ball in like essentially the fewer possessions they run where Luka dribbles the ball up the floor, calls for a pick and roll until he gets a switch, and then backs his guy down or does whatever he does to get an open shot. The fewer possessions that they run that look like that, the better. It's just they don't have even with Kyrie, they don't have the talent to be able to run a lot of, if they had even just like one more ball handler, they could do some some old Spurs loop stuff where you'd like enter the ball, run the baseline, maybe mid post on the other side or something like that, like enter the ball there. At times they've done some of that, but they don't have, okay, well, Luka gives the ball up. If Kyrie doesn't have it in a playoff setting, I'm telling my guys, jump the guy. If it's right. Tim Hardaway Jr., make a play, against pressure defense, Tim Hardaway Jr., Reggie Bullock, Maxi Kleba. I dare you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Defense is going to do that every time.
Yeah. So it's on some level, I still need to be convinced that Luka is willing to be a more off-ball, more movement player, but it's not like he's been given rosters that give him much of a chance to do so at any point in his career.
That's fair. It's even with Kyrie, it seems like there's even less depth, so it seems like he has to have the ball even more than he did before. He has a more a better scorer on the team, but without more, like you were just talking about before, multiple ball handlers, he just doesn't have that, so he just kind of has to take over.
And they haven't really, they haven't played together enough to develop sort of and this was something that the Sixers had a little bit of a problem with it early in the year when Maxey was starting, is Harden and Maxey hadn't really created a lot of synergy of playing off of each other, where it's more difficult for a defense because you have these two guys that each of them is a threat when the other one has the ball. I don't think the Mavs have figured that out yet, just because they haven't had time. I don't think the Rockets ever really did with those two. And you contrast that with I think a team that where it has worked is Cleveland, where in part because I think both Garland and Mitchell are more willing off ball movers and shooters than Trey or Luka or Harden are. But when you're that invested in kind of offense, you need to have that synergy to make it like not just great but special. Like those two have to be, for the Mavs to have a chance, those two have to create special offense. And it's like, it's still what they've gotten so far is both of them individually still being very good without kind of that overlap stressing a defense to the point where it breaks.
Yeah. And how many games have they even had to do that yet? So
right.
Interesting to see how all these teams shake out in the playoffs, like you were saying.
For sure.
Yeah.
Seth, I know you got to go soon, so we'll just hit you with one more topic, I guess. And this is centered around a conversation that you brought up on Twitter actually today. I saw it and it just kind of piqued my interest, so I wanted to talk to you about it. That is your tweet you had earlier today regarding the Nuggets and their crazy offense and slipping defense. And then for Milwaukee, it's the opposite. So you mentioned in your tweet earlier that regular season offense is a better indicator of how our team will perform in the postseason. And then I also took a screenshot of one of the responses you got on Twitter, which was they mentioned that the conference finalists from last year, so we're looking at the Warriors, Celtics, Heat, and Mavericks, all had top 6 defenses in that position. Now, I'm not sure that was just an outlier. I know typically in my experience, I've thought of the teams that make it to the finals or conference finals as being, I would say at least top 10 defense or so. And he just mentioned if you are a good defensive team, you're not winning a ring. And I think I've heard that a few times throughout the season. So just want to get your thoughts on some of the ways that offense is a better predictor of, postseason success related to your tweet.
I mean, I think part of it is I think if you're not a good defense, you're probably not winning a title. I'm just the degree to which regular season defense reflects playoff defense is I think that is a strained connection. So it's not so much that it's not that defense doesn't translate. It's just that the measures we have for whole season, regular season defense, there's all kinds of different things we can look at in terms of, okay, how do you perform? How does your defense perform against better teams, better offenses in close games? All of these other things that might be more. I haven't had time to really dive into these various other ways, but that might be more predictive than just kind of the full season. Like, who cares how well you guard the Spurs?
Right.
We're talking about whereas offense kind of is more kind of almost scalable. If you if you can if you're good enough to put up 120 on the Celtics, you're going to put up 135 on the Spurs.
Right.
And it's sort of it sort of scales that way. And so all of which is to say that over the last decade, again, offense has been, it's not that defense doesn't matter. It's just that offense has how well a team, gets good shots and makes shots relative to league average has been about twice as predictive of how deep they go in the playoffs as how well they do not allow good shots and how well they kind of suppress opposing shooting. Part of that is I think that, suppressing opposing shooting is only partially in a team's control. It's more, it's odd. Like the thing that has shown up as being correlated pretty strongly has been opponent 3-point shot making, which is the area of defense where defenses typically have the least control, at least as expressed.
Right.
And so there's some weird stuff going. Yeah, of course you're gonna find good defensive teams going to deeper rounds, but you're not gonna find you're gonna find good offensive teams too. Like last year's Miami team was probably a little bit of an outlier in that respect.
Sadly, I agree.
Yeah.
Sadly, I agree. They were 10th in offense last year, 5th in defense, and I actually wanted to mention them. Kind of tying into that, if you look at least regular season performance, those teams that have struggled in offense, Miami is a prime example. They have one of the, I think they have a bottom 3-point percentage for the season, and you look at them, they're struggling just to get in the playoffs as a top 6 seed in the East. Meanwhile, you have the Kings, who they're definitely in the bottom third of the league in defense, but they have number 1 offense thereabouts, and you look at them are almost number 2 in the Western Conference. So at least from a regular season perspective, and like you said, there's definitely a level that translates. It looks like a strong offense can carry you to a degree that the strong defense can't. Just because at certain times, if you can't generate good shots, you're just going to get stuck in the mud. You just don't have a chance to win. And sadly, I've seen that many times, many Heat games this season where it's Jimmy Butler or bust, and they just really, really struggle, and they lose some games they should win. Rockets games, Hornets games, things of that nature, where the Kings would just kind of outscore teams like they had that 176-175 blockbuster game earlier this season. So there's something I noticed.
Yeah, and I don't think that's a universal truth, by the way. There's probably been eras in NBA history where defense has been more, in a more defensive era, like being best at that. It might have been more of a playoff important thing. But the era we're in now, like, teams are gonna score, so you got to score more.
Right.
So I think that's just reflective of where we are as a league now, and that's that's sort of I don't know, to get back to our earlier discussion about like AI, like how do you know when that changes? How do you know to look for when that changes? Like there are there are certain stylistic rule factors, player skill, player mix, all of these things that can change. If we were in a gaming setting, they change the meta of the game.
Right.
And you have to always be aware when that changes, because otherwise you're building a championship team to win. The people made jokes about the Clippers. Man, they're sure going to win the 2018 championship with the rosters they've been putting together. And I think that's a little bit unfair, but at the same time, like the age of their roster has kind of probably hurt them a little bit. And so, but just from a style standpoint, like, you mentioned like those Harden teams, like the style of play would probably, like, defenses hadn't really figured out how to totally handle the spread pick and roll, spread ISO, one guy does everything with shooters around him, shooters and a dive man around him. Now with with switching, with some rotation stuff, like that style has probably been, I don't want to say found, like, yeah, a little bit found out. It's not as effective as some of the more multi-threat offenses are. And so those things, like, those things are always going to change over time, and we have to be ready to adjust when they do.
Exactly. No, 100% agree with that. So that sounds like a good time to end off our discussion. Seth, thanks so much for joining us again. We really appreciate your work. Love what you do. Keep up the great work. I will definitely try to go out there and grab myself a copy of the Mid-Range Theory. If you guys are listening, definitely be sure to grab a copy. It's some really good work.
Great book. I highly suggest it.
Yes, 100%. You guys will not regret it if you're in any way, shape, or form a basketball fan. So definitely check that out.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, we got you. We got you.
Yeah.
But of course, we got to plug our own work a little bit here as well. Just want to let the people know we do have our website, notradeclause.com. We have a variety of resources on our website, including written work. All our podcasts are there. Cap sheets as well as draft capital are available on our website. So if you guys are looking for some information on the back end, definitely check us out. That's updated as we get closer to free agency, the draft, all that stuff will be updated for you guys. So definitely be sure to check that out. So that's about it for us this time around. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, we'll be back real soon with another episode and another special guest. So thanks everybody for taking the time tonight, and we'll catch you on the next installment of NTC. Take care.